Right. Joining me for another round of whatever this is CAConservative. Welcome back.
Hello.
Right. So last time we were talking about maps. Why don't we talk about current events? What's going on in Ukraine?
Just more and more victories.
Yep.
A
Uh,
significant depletion of resources along the Donbass and everybody's favorite city. Seeing a
Bakhmut.
lot of videos of Russians being forced to withdraw, which whole squads wiped out.
See, there's a number of cities I think could be described as everyone's favorite. There's Bakhmut, there's Lyman, there's Kherson, um, Kyiv,
This one I think holds a special place just because the battle's been going on for a decade there.
Bakhmut.
Yeah, that was one of the first cities captured by the separatists. It was one of the first cities that separatists were driven out of.
Yep.
And yet, even today, they continue to waste every spare resource they have on a city they will never be able to take.
For sure. And I'm curious to know, like, do you think this could end in the full liberation of Ukrainian territory?
That'd be the most likely option, I'd say.
You say think it's more likely. You think they're actually going to be able to take Crimea?
Oh yeah, I'd say that's the easiest part. Because once you destroy the bridge, they can't supply themselves.
Right. And I would argue that the once with the bridge out and the bridge continuing to be out, the next thing Ukraine wants to do is blitzkrieg to Melitopol.
You could. There's no real reason to.
I was gonna
Um,
I was gonna argue that it would put put southern half of Kherson and Crimea under siege.
It would, but it would also leave them heavily exposed. The attrition warfare we've seen is exactly what they need to be doing, and it is exactly what they are doing.
Yeah, I mean, so you don't think the Ukrainians are going to strike again at Zaporizhia?
That's probably the next attack, but I don't think it's near coming.
Okay.
Not without Bakhmut becoming a lot easier.
Yeah.
Um, Ukrainians have devoted a lot of troops there. They have at least 20,000 um, defending the city and its surrounding area. Many of their best troops.
Cool. Yeah, I
So,
mean, yeah,
um, difficult. They probably still don't have the forces to dedicate everybody to one place.
yeah, for sure. Taking a look at some other countries, Argentina has an election next year. How do you think that's going to go?
The question is just if the right will screw themselves by running two candidates, which they will, but it'll
Yeah,
be curious to see.
the guy I heard that the right should run is the mayor of Buenos Aires.
Yes,
Yeah. Hopping around, Paraguay also has an election coming up.
I
Although,
saw
mind
the Colorado party had a good candidate.
the money Paraguay, I guess elections can be put in quotations when it comes to Paraguay.
Mm, The right person wins, so as far as I'm concerned, it's fair.
Okay. Yeah, no, because I'm told that as far as Latin American countries go, like Uruguay is one of the better run countries along with Chile.
Not really these days.
Right.
Here
Um,
they're going again for another constitution excursion.
really they're gonna do
Uh,
another one of those?
if the electorate continues to return a constituent assembly has a supermajority of left-wing candidates, then it's going to
Right.
continue to be a disaster.
I hope not. Um, so I mean, yeah, sorry, I'm dealing with a lot of stuff as well. So,
Yeah, actually, that would be my preferred option because it would make it more likely the Constitution will fail. I like the current Constitution.
yeah, the current constitution is pretty good. And I think everyone pretty much agrees that the constitution that they were going to adopt this summer was a good thing that it was voted down.
Yes, I mean the locals don't seem to like it. It's a very right-wing Constitution.
Yeah, it's very
But
neoliberal. I love it.
yeah,
Yeah. Just hopping around. Anything else coming up? of note in the coming year?
I'm curious, is it a common opinion among your friends that Pierre is in fact a creep?
Pierre Poilievre?
Yes.
I mean, my circle of conservative friends are have had enough of Trudeau, and they will walk over burning coals to vote for the guy who's going to boot him out of office.
Yeah, but notwithstanding that,
I mean, I personally think that Pierre is Poilievre is a dolt. Um, but my father voted for him, and I mean, so I just I'm not sure. All right.
just something I had heard.
Okay. I don't know if I like him. But I mean, I also don't like Trudeau. Um, so I'm just yeah. Sorry, I'm also a little bit distracted. I don't know if people know this. I'm getting married in a week and dealing with a lot.
Good thing to be distracted by.
Yeah, it is a good thing to be distracted by. Turning to, is there anything going on in Africa lately?
Just more Russian victories.
More Russian victories in Africa. So Africa is Russia's stomping ground as it has been for decades.
It's getting worse because the French refuse to do anything to defend their back door.
The Sahel.
No, like Mali, Chad, so yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking more like Mali, yeah, that area. That's
Yeah,
Sahel. Although mind you, there's been some good news out of Somalia these days. The government
they're,
there is beating back Al-Shabaab.
I mean, they're holding on, which is their only objective, so I guess you could charitably describe that as a win.
Yeah. Ethiopia, on the other hand, is going to pot.
Not as bad as we would have said 6 months ago, though.
Yeah, I'm thinking more of the involvement of Eritrea, which I've heard described as the African North Korea.
I mean, yeah, but they've been involved since the beginning. Nothing's really changed there.
Yeah. Um, Apparently in Indonesia, they're also past like they're restricting freedom there.
Mm, with what part? The changes to website registration or what?
The criminalization of personal conduct.
Haven't seen that. I believe it though.
Yeah. Yeah, basically I think that the current president and the government has taken a more Islamist turn.
Most governments there have, although in Malaysia they formed a coalition to keep them out.
Didn't the opposition win like the era in Malaysia like 4 years ago, and something happened that the guys who were in power just somehow came back? I don't know how that happened.
They won a fairly narrow majority and they just lost it. They have a lot of, when we say somebody won, there's a lot of different parties across the country. It wasn't surprising that they pulled in everybody who didn't like them to take power.
Yeah. Um, how do you feel about the current government in India these days?
Tragically pro-Russian,
Yep.
along with the rest of Indian society.
it just you'd think that India would be an ally that the West could convince to join them, right?
India has different ideas,
Like their opposition to China.
but likewise with the Israelis, they there's a significant cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, I mean, well, Israel also has like a large Soviet expat population.
Not in the current government, they don't.
Not that, yeah, they don't, but
They all voted for Lieberman, and Lieberman's on the other side.
yeah, I imagine Lieberman is the kind of guy who would join the government if Bibi were gone.
He was in the government before.
Yep. But so it's really just personal with him.
Well, it's his constituency.
Yeah, I mean, also the fact that the current government, though, they may pass a change to the law of return that Lieberman's constituents would not like.
That one grandparent thing,
Yeah. So
which I
basically,
believe they've ruled out.
oh,
Um,
they're not going to do that now.
well, at least BB says they won't. However much that's worth,
Well, I mean, half his coalition may want that.
they might. But obviously, in a vote in the legislature, they would lose since nobody else wants that, except maybe the Arabs. It would restrict Jewish immigration.
It would. And so, maybe they won't. I mean, well, it depends. This is all comes back down to the debate of who is a Jew. This is a classic debate. You know,
It is, and it's one the Orthodox should lose.
you really think so?
Well, I mean, if I were Jewish, I would want to be as liberal as possible on that question, given how loyal those people have ended up being.
Yeah, for sure. I guess so. I guess you're right. I've always been more in the religious Zionist camp, not with the current leadership in the religious Zionist camp, though. I'm not a fan of Smoltrek or particularly Ben Gavir.
You mean you're not a Jewish terrorist?
True.
Or more precisely, openly a Jewish terrorist?
Yeah, for those you don't know, Ben Gavir, like before entering politics, was basically a defense attorney for people like Yigal Amir, who, for those you don't know, Yigal Amir was the guy who assassinated Yitzhak Rabin.
Which on its own is fine, but having a picture of him in your house is a little out there.
Yeah, same. And I mean, there are kooks also who defend Benny Friedman as, or sorry, not Benny Friedman. Benny Friedman is somebody else. Baruch Goldstein. You know who he was?
Didn't he massacre a bunch of Palestinians at a
At the Merat
shopping center or
Machpelah.
something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for those of you watching, you get to hear what some of these places are called. But yeah, there was a big massacre at the Merat Machpelah in Hebron in 1994. And at least, up until now, no one in mainstream Israeli politics would have called that guy a hero. They would have called him a terrorist.
Well, that's because he was one. But that's the reason why the wall there protects both sides.
Yeah, for sure. There's also if you ever visit the area near north of Bethlehem, there's a wall running all the way to Kever Rachel or Rachel's tomb, and it separates it from the rest of the city because the Rachel's tomb is basically a place where a lot of Jews like to go, and they generally prefer not to be stabbed to death by terrorists.
Yeah. Well, you keep both sides apart and it avoids that kind of thing.
Yeah. I
Especially when
mean,
each side decides to retaliate. We can't have that.
I mean, I was hopeful about the idea that Israel might actually incorporate around 61% of the West Bank into Israel. Like I felt like that would have been a good thing.
I mean, it effectively is anyway, so there's no real difference other than semantics.
Yeah, but although the real difference would actually have been that around, I don't know, Palestinians living in that part would have actually gotten a chance to become Israeli
Well, I mean, there's plenty of people with similar status in
in East
East
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem that don't accept Israeli citizenship, so
Yeah. So I
I
mean,
don't think there'd be any real difference there. Back in the day, they still voted in PA elections.
yeah.
Um,
But I mean, as far as
but
Israel's concerned, East Jerusalem is Israel. So
yeah,
I
and with the
I, I would
continued settlement development, it basically is.
yeah, I mean, I would argue let's do the same thing with the part of the West Bank that is mixed population,
There are no parts of the West Bank that are mixed population. There's a wall that keeps each side on theirs.
right? I mean,
Even if you see villages next to each other, there's probably a significant amount of concrete between them. Hebron being the most obvious example.
yeah, Hebron in particular is like that. And Jews are only allowed to live on one street in Hebron.
Admittedly, that street is quite sizable, but no, their area is the settlement on the east side of the highway.
Yeah, or Kiryat Arba.
Sure.
Yeah, there's Hebron proper, but then there's also the neighboring town of Kiryat Arba.
Yeah. But there's not even that much settlement inside the Israeli sector.
Yeah.
mostly shops and tombs.
Yeah, the big concentration of Jewish residents in the West Bank is actually in Shomron, the Samaria.
Sounds about right.
It's like you have places like Ariel. Like, sorry, there's two places. There's the southwestern Shomron and eastern area east of Jerusalem. Those are the two big ones. The area between Jerusalem and Ma'ale Adumim.
I have seen the barriers that go by. The maps on it make clear where everybody lives.
Yeah, these are among the places that you would call gated communities because they are literally gated and guarded.
Yeah, at least the highways into them are gated.
Yeah.
I mean,
Um,
largely it's a question of there is no solution. There is no option that leads to happiness for anybody, and it's just a question of accepting that.
See, people had this idea that if Abbas was succeeded by someone like Muhammad Dalin, that maybe they could negotiate with him.
Doubt it. Abbas is fairly reasonable. Um, Certainly versus the younger generation.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem with the new government is just going to be the trolling,
Yeah.
the continued settlement development where it isn't necessary, the continued restrictions on crossings in places where, farms and communities were split by the barrier. Um, those are the kind of things that the Israelis should try to keep at a minimum, and and the new government is not going to do that.
Yeah. I mean, also we can't forget that there may be moves to make it harder for non-Orthodox rabbis to operate in the country.
I
In
believe that.
terms of like government funding of like schools and synagogues and
Well, there's already going to be big subsidies for the Orthodox.
yeah, because they vote. The Orthodox vote. They know what they want.
Yeah, or more precisely, they have a small enough number of parties to where the threshold doesn't F them over.
Yeah, I mean, what if Netanyahu tried to raise the threshold to 5%, which under if that had been the rules, like a number of parties on the left would have failed.
They'll all just combine.
Yeah.
The only reason it worked here is that there was no change to encourage the Arabs to unite, and they thought they could get away with splitting,
Yeah. I
or at
mean,
least Ballad thought it could get away with splitting.
I wasn't expecting joint lists to get dismembered again.
They all hate each other. I mean, that's not. They've hated each other for a long time, and it was only the threat of the threshold going up like 0.5% to you know
3.75%. Yeah.
yeah, I think it went from maybe it was at 2.75 to 3.25,
Yeah, okay.
which was deliberately targeted at the Arabs because they only got like 3%.
Well,
Or they each kind of got 3% in like 2013 or something.
yeah. I mean, well, they used to get a low percentage, and then they all of a sudden in 2019 and in the second election they showed up and they became the third largest party.
Yeah, which is about right. There are a lot of Arabs. There are t still tons of Arab villages around
Right,
Israel
like
proper.
Abu Ghush, like just near Jerusalem.
Yeah, and they obviously have a right to representation as everybody else does. It'd be nice if they were somewhat reasonable, but that may be a little high of an expectation.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, honestly, if I'm being honest, like I don't think that annexation of parts of the West Bank would be a bad thing if more Palestinians got to be part of Israel as a result.
I mean, they don't want to be part of Israel. That's the problem.
Yeah.
They would prefer not. And the other problem is that Israel's only future goal needs to be to keep the PA alive.
Why keep them alive?
If the PA collapses, then who governs Palestine?
Hamas,
But
right?
they're still barely a government. They're still just part of the PA in Gaza.
So I mean, the IDF would probably take over.
Yeah, and the IDF doesn't want that. They didn't want that before. That was the biggest driver towards Oslo being signed, is they didn't want to have to deal with that anymore.
You know that there was
Um,
actually a proposal back in before Oslo. It was by the government of Yitzhak Shamir, who basically his idea was basically to allow several Palestinian cities to elect mayors, which would who would serve as negotiators of peace, and they would that would basically in effect bypass the PLO. And it failed partly because the Bush administration at the time actually leaked their opposition to it to the media, which brought down Shamir's government and allowed for Yitzhak Rabin to get elected. Who actually he opposed that idea on the grounds he argued it would put IDF soldiers at unnecessary risk.
Which is true. It's fairly similar to the backup plan that's being introduced today. Um, the fundamental problem is that the West Bank, the Palestinian sections of the West Bank, are far too divided to govern on an independent basis like that.
Yeah,
Um, there
and
needs to be some central authority, a central authority that, for at least now, by and large, does work.
right. People also, point out that the reason why the two-state solution was in Israel's interest is because of the demographic concerns that if Israel absorbed too many Palestinians, they would no longer be a Jewish majority country. But religious Zionists, like myself, have sometimes countered that concern may be overblown because the Palestinians probably overstate their numbers.
I mean, the earlier censuses were taken by Israelis, and even if there were significant estimates, they're not going to be that wrong.
Right.
Um, I mean, the latest demographic figures show Jews gaining at a far higher rate than Muslims.
Yeah, no, and
But it's just a question of, can you absorb such a hostile population that even if you placate some of them, they'll still have a large proportion that absolutely hate you.
and
A two-state solution would be nice, but it isn't going to happen. So it's more going to be a zero-state solution,
I
where
mean,
it's just sort of Oslo runs it all, even if it wasn't intended for that.
it was only intended for 5 years.
Yeah,
Like we're now entering year 30 of a 5 year program.
yeah. Probably more like 10, given the negotiations to replace it terminated about a decade after. Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, I mean it's
the fundamental problem is just obviously the PA is not legitimate. It has very little support outside of the people who are paid by it. But that has to be good enough.
yeah, Abbas has served 17 years now of his 4 year term.
Yeah. Or what do they say in the documentary? He's a man, and you can negotiate with a man.
Yeah. I wish you were right about that. I don't think he's someone you can negotiate with anymore.
Well, he's not actively trying to create anarchy like Hamas's leaders, so
I mean,
it's all
although
relative.
it depends, like people, there's this joke that like when Abbas speaks in English, he's promoting peace. When he speaks in Arabic, he's promoting violence.
Of course, but the alternative is uh he doesn't speak peace in either language.
Yeah. I mean,
You only get the enemies that you have. You don't get to just make new ones, unfortunately.
well, I mean, Abbas moving on one way or another is inevitable at this point. He's
He'll die of old age eventually.
yeah, and the question is not if but when. Yeah.
Yeah,
And when that happens, you know, who's going to take over? And right now,
whoever his number two is, I guess.
I mean, well, right now, I just assume that if Abbas died, that new elections would be called and they would happen and Hamas would win.
That's why they will never happen.
Yeah,
That
that's why.
none of the other usual suspects will allow it.
So that's why Abbas is going to be made to he's going basically the jokes that people told about Ruth Bader Ginsburg about if she died that they would keep parading her body around like making it seem like she was alive. I assume they'd do that to Abbas.
I'm sure they have the power to appoint their successor.
Yeah, I mean
I
I
don't know why you would design things to where a new election had to be held. It's not, this isn't 1800s UK anymore.
because that election was supposed to be held back in 2010.
Yeah, but after, you've moved on to year 18 of your 4-year term, why not just keep going? It's it's a parliamentary system, so it's not as if it's designed to immediately fail as soon as somebody dies.
Yeah, true.
Not that law actually matters, you can just change that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I just, I really wish that there was actually a path towards some sort of peaceful solution. It saddens me that the Holy Land has to be a land of war and not a land of peace.
Let's just say it's difficult to break with 3,000 years of tradition.
Yep. All right. What's going on in like the southern Eastern Asia, that area?
Nothing particularly good. Myanmar continues its genocidal campaign against its own people.
The Rohingyas.
No, this is against those who oppose them.
Right. So yeah, I mean, yeah, the civil war in Myanmar still going on.
And
And
quite violently.
yep. And apparently people are fleeing to Bangladesh, and Bangladesh doesn't want them.
Can't afford them.
And oh yeah, Taliban, no women in schools at all.
That's
Like,
shocking. Although actually that isn't remotely surprising, and anybody who expresses shock should be removed from public life for being incompetent.
yeah, it was like
Um, the
who
more interesting thing is how bad things have been starting to get in Pakistan.
oh, I mean, Imran Khan was ousted and he's plotting his comeback sometime.
Here's a concern, but just the significant amount of terrorist attacks and attacks on the military in the past few weeks.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean,
Counterterrorism base attacked, bunch of officers and hostages killed there. Seems like daily there's a new bombing on a convoy.
yeah, that sucks. Uh,
Well, I mean, some people would say they're getting what they deserve.
yeah. Um, is anything else of note happening? Like Taiwan, maybe, nothing going on there, like besides an impending war.
Well, I mean, they had that big air defense incursion. They are not taking things as seriously as they need to.
You- I mean, I've heard it basically said that there's a concern that in this coming year will be peak China, and that China will therefore decide it's now or never.
Maybe they're pretty weak though internally. COVID has hurt them quite severely, which is really funny, by the way.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
how long were they possibly going to be able to continue with zero COVID?
well, now that they've completely ended it, they're now getting overwhelmed. So they've managed to make zero COVID look good, which is never good.
Yeah, no, that's I mean, how did Australia better manage this than China?
It's an island.
Yeah, I guess so. It's like they also had strict lockdowns for a while, but eventually, I think now things are back to normal there.
Yeah, it's an island, and they have like vaccines. In China, they don't.
Yeah, yeah,
You
no,
have to get the
that's
worst of all worlds, the worst variants
they can't
combined
take the
with no
vaccines.
vaccine.
They can't take the vaccines because then they would admit that capitalism is good.
Yeah, and their own vaccines don't work, so there's no real concern there.
Yep. You might remember this, but when I got the vaccine, I actually tweeted out the words, "Thank you, Big Pharma."
Well, I mean, I always say that.
Okay. So I mean, I just thought it would piss off the right people.
Well, of course. It is marginally funny how they continue to expose themselves. You do have to appreciate how AOC managed to prevent us from having to deal with only our people oppose the omnibus.
Yeah, oh yeah, that bill, from what I heard, contained a lot of stuff, like including Electoral Count Reform Act. It was in there, which I think was a good thing. It didn't include the Afghan Adjustment Act, that's a bad thing they didn't include it. Um, and
I
they
think
kind of
Schumer was to blame for that. There was a couple of things in there that should have been passed independently, and he made sure to throw them in just to troll everybody.
Yeah, like immigration should have been dealt with separately.
But it is the must-pass bill, and so, it's sort of the bring out your dead of legislation.
Yep. And so, I mean, it's a good thing they got the Electoral Count Reform Act passed. I just, there were a couple other things I think some of my friends were hoping for, like Afghan Adjustment Act. Schumer didn't support that.
No, I think he wants some immigration grand bargain kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, border security
Um,
for DACA would be a good idea.
because if you put that kind of thing on the floor, it would pass immediately. So,
Border security with DACA, yeah, that would pass.
no, but the Adjustment Act.
Oh, wait. Afghan Adjustment Act. So yeah, that would pass like what? 420 to 1?
No, the House would probably see maybe 100 no's from the
Oh wow.
usual suspects, but it's the Senate that won't pass it because obviously, um, you need the Senate Majority Leader to do anything. So,
Yeah, I mean, why don't people want to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act?
because they want more with it. Never give up your leverage.
Yeah, I mean, that it's really unfortunate they're playing politics with the people who worked for us.
That's how politics works.
But what about on immigration? Because like I keep saying, immigration, border security for DACA, like those are two popular things that should pass.
Neither side will do it because the problem is, especially given these mass convoys we've seen, we want to violate international law, and Dems would prefer ICE to not exist. So,
Yeah. It's amazing. We can't actually reasonably talk about this issue. Like this is actually something that bothers me that we can't reasonably talk about this issue.
well, surely that applies to almost every issue, no?
Right. By the way, it's also another thing like with regard to the debate about inflation versus a recession, you could probably argue why I prefer a recession over inflation.
That is generally the right wing belief.
Yeah, also, generally when we've had a lot of inflation, it hasn't exactly ended well for us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's obvious that this lot failed to um, anticipate how bad inflation would get.
Yeah, I mean, well, you say by the way, inflation is sorry that recession is better than inflation, but it's worth noting that when we passed those tax cuts, it also led to an economy heating up.
Which isn't necessarily bad, but when it's already heating up and you heat it up further, after you've been heating it up for a while, I mean, obviously, those tax cuts came after a significant period of austerity, whereas IRA came after, very many rounds of stimulus.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I just let's talk about Europe before we maybe call it an evening. But I'm curious to know my focus of the week has actually been what's known as the GI-UK gap, because I feel like Russia is probably going to be transitioning away from conventional nuclear deterrence towards nuclear submarines.
Which they
And
can't afford. Their funniest carrier is on fire again.
oh wow. Oh wait. They were able to put out the fire the first time?
Well, after it took the dry dock with it.
Oh wow.
But now the new dry dock, it's sitting in there burning again. What a shame.
Yeah. Why don't we just give Ukraine the Atoms and allow them to force the Russian ships away from the peninsula?
I mean, they have the Neptune. There's no easy target to waste it on, though. The Russian Navy hasn't been seen in a long time. There's very little point to even bothering.
Yeah.
I think they've even had to flee to their ports closer to Georgia.
Yep. And the reason why I bring up the GIUK gap is because there's active independence movements on like three different parts of that area that Russia, I think, may seek to exploit. Like Greenland is the big one. Well, actually, it's not the big one, but it's one of them. It is the Faroe Islands is the second one, and then finally it's Scotland. And
Well, I
of
mean,
those,
Scotland's 50-50. The other two are virtually independent anyway. I don't know what would be the point of that.
I mean, like full independence, leave NATO, and not and possibly align with Russia. Like apparently, like the Faroe Islands already receives subsidies from Russia.
Probably. I mean, but I mean, they functionally have their own parliament.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
but
they have their own trade deals. They're not fully a member of the
but the American and
European
Danish
market.
military, but the American and Danish militaries are able to operate there.
Yeah.
So, what would have happened if the Faroe Islands or Greenland were to say, "Yo, Americans, Danish, leave"?
Well, I mean, it would be a long, drawn out process like Scotland would be.
You don't think
I
that?
mean, they've debated these questions before and have always supported the right option.
Yeah, I mean, you don't think that American President DeSantis would basically send American troops to take over the whole lot?
I mean, there'd be no point to that.
Yeah, I mean,
They're not. They're pretty competitive places. It isn't like Scotland, which is like 75% left wing. They both have mostly pro-European bunches in power.
yeah. Okay, so I mean, there's no danger of Greenland or the Faroe Islands telling American and Danish troops to go suck it.
Doubt it. They'd be probably shot if they tried that. If the more violent leaving option was chosen.
Yeah, I mean, but also there's unlike with Scotland, the Denmark is under no obligation to even allow them to vote on a non-binding referendum, right?
Mm, well, I mean, they have obviously a constitution. They have a much more independent parliament than Scotland has. Um,
Right.
so not really. I don't. I doubt Scotland would go for it. The nationalists aren't stupid enough to try it unless they think they'd win, and it's 50-50.
I think the nightmare scenario, I think what would actually functionally end up being a an independence referendum is if in the next UK election, if you have a situation where it's a hung parliament and Labour can get a government if they ally with the SNP. And and for good measure, let's create maximum chaos and make it so that they also need Plaid Cymru and Shin, no, not Shin, the SDLP.
I mean, the SDLP is functionally allied with them anyway.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, even Northern Ireland, the census results are trash. I wouldn't even look at them.
Yeah, I was gonna say Sinn Féin, but then I realized, oh yeah, that the Sinn Féin guys don't take their seats.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, you would just probably see an increase in powers. Even though I think Plaid Cymru is probably going to do fairly well in the next Welsh Assembly election, just because they're slightly more reasonable than the bunch that run the place now.
Yeah. I mean, so I've been reading apparently now Catholics outnumber Protestants in Northern Ireland.
According to really trash census results, anyway.
But if that is the case, doesn't the UK now have to call a border poll?
No, they only have to call a border poll if the minister reasonably thinks that a border poll would succeed. And right now, it won't. The Catholic support is not high enough amongst their own people. And nor will anybody who isn't Catholic vote in favor of it.
Oh, I think younger Protestants may be open to the idea because for younger people, it's not about partisanship. It's about, NHS or, taxes or jobs.
Then why change? The problem with Northern Ireland is I don't think Ireland wants it. The place is heavily subsidized. The economy is extremely weak. Um, and you'd have to deal with all the security problems.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we'll see what happens. I think we should call it for now. We'll resume this conversation another time.
Sure.